Okay, welcome everybody to our Wednesday lecture here at 2026 Kane Summer Institute. And today we have Peter Machinist, who has been a longtime friend of Kane and the Summer Institute, as many of you know, on the Harvard faculty since 1991 after a teaching career that took him all over the U.S. Peter retired in 2017 and is now the Hancock Research Professor of Hebrew and other Oriental languages. He has published widely on the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Testament, including the book Provincial Governance in Middle Assyria, and numerous essays and articles. Today, as you can see, he will speak to us on monotheism and how it is expressed in the Hebrew Bible, particularly Psalm 82 and 2nd Isaiah. Peter, thank you for coming back to the Kane Summer Institute.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be part of this esteemed establishment of colleagues and friends. And I would just say by way of beginning that my experience with Kane, starting I think in 1989, is really one of the life-changing experiences of my professional career. So let's begin. The importance of the theme of monotheism to the study of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, probably does not need any explanation or defense. Most of us understand the concept of monotheism, however we define it, and I'll come back to this issue shortly. Most of us understand monotheism as a principal, if not the principal contribution that the Bible has made to human history and culture. Within the traditions that grew out of the Hebrew Bible, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the concept of a single God remains central, even if these religions have had various ways of perceiving the matter. Consider, for example, a statement from the Babylonian Talmud, the major legal collection of rabbinic Judaism, quote, "Anyone who denies the existence of other gods is called Jewish."
Do you want me to click and see a different slide, or is this still okay?
Not yet. Thank you. Several terms are basic to the modern scholarly discussion, both recent and earlier, of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible. At one end, there is the term polytheism. Essentially, this describes a religion that views the universe populated by a number of gods who in various ways are worshipped. A popular view of polytheism, popular at least in the West, is that this multiplicity of gods exists in random, chaotic confusion. But a study of polytheistic religions refutes such a view. The gods rather belong to a system or a set of interlocked systems, normally with a hierarchy or hierarchies of authority, as well as kinship among the gods represented. The system has often been labeled after the Greek term for it, a pantheon. Yet as a system, one should note, it is not static but dynamic, revealing changes in placement and even structure over time and place. At the other end of the spectrum of discussion is the term monotheism. This is a term that has had a number of definitions, but placed over against polytheism, it is probably best to define it very strictly and philosophically as the belief that there is only one deity and that that deity consequently is the only one that can be worshipped. Rephrased in a kind of mathematical way, monotheism may be described as the proposition that for the category or set called deity, there is only one member. Two other terms must be brought into the discussion, monolatry and henotheism, and they fall on the spectrum we've been depicting between polytheism and monotheism. Monolatry, monolatry, describes the situation in which a particular community accepts and worships only one God for itself, although it may acknowledge that other communities have their own deities, which may in turn be recognized as the equivalent of or inferior, even subordinate to their own God. The concept of monolatry has proved to be very important in the scholarly discussion of biblical monotheism. Henotheism, Henotheism, henotheism is our last term, and it's the most difficult because it has not always been defined clearly or in the same way by those who have used it. Sometimes it has been treated more or less as a synonym of monolatry, but then the term becomes superfluous. I adopt a different definition in which the focus remains on one deity, but the deity is one that has absorbed or embodied within itself other deities in their powers and functions, a process that has not erased all traces or even worship of these other deities. Put another way, henotheism is a concept of the memory, of the many in the one, e pluribus unum, perhaps. So considered, this term can be a potentially helpful one in understanding the phenomenon of biblical monotheism within the wider world of the ancient Middle East. If we go now to the last page of this PowerPoint.
The last page. Oi.
Yeah,
Back.
that's it. That's no, back to that last page, please.
Okay, so let's go back. Okay, hold on. Hold on. Okay. Tell me when to stop.
Page 5.
Is this page 5? Page 4.
No,
Page 5.
that's it.
Okay.
So under number 20, we have an example of a kind of henotheistic situation. I wonder if we can enlarge the page so that
That is a good question. Does anyone know how to enlarge this? Well, that was enthusiasm. I unfortunately have no idea. However,
if I were to do it myself, I could enlarge it, but I can't seem to get a share.
yes.
This is in PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay, let me let's see here.
Ruth, at the bottom of your screen, it looks like there's yeah, that magnifying glass right next to your
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so that's going to be this. Ha!
Good.
Brilliance! Brilliance!
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In this example of a list of gods from ancient Mesopotamia, apparently around the late Bronze Age or about the 13th century BC, is an example of what is called a three-column god list. In the first column to the left, we have the god Ninurta. In the second column to the middle is the god Marduk. And the right-hand column has a description. So as Wilfred Lambert, from whom I've taken this particular example, explains, you have to understand these three columns in the following way. The god Ninurta is the name of the god Marduk as the god of the pick, Sha'ali. Sha is of an Akkadian, and Alu is the word for pick or hoe. In other words, Marduk is the central deity here and is in the central column, but he has assimilated the god Ninurta in terms of Ninurta's capacity to rule over the pick or the hoe. And that is what I'm calling a kind of henotheism. Okay, we go back now to our situation.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so we go out of that. Okay.
Go back to the beginning. No, we can go to the next one.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's hold it there for a moment. The four terms that I've mentioned, polytheism, monotheism, monolatry, and henotheism, have formed something of a framework for the discussion of biblical monotheism over the last 2 centuries. The discussion is long and involved with a variety of different expressions and controversies. At the risk of oversimplifying it, let me suggest several trends or issues that have become dominant in this discussion. The first is the argument that monotheism, in the strict sense I defined earlier, the only deity, the pure form of monotheism, in other words. Monotheism in this strict sense came late in the history of ancient Israel, the Israel to which the Hebrew Bible refers. It is not, in this view, to be found in the earliest phases of Israelite history as described in the Bible, namely the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, nor in the period following of Moses, nor in that period following the initial settlement in the land of Israel, to which the Bible affixes the names of Joshua and the Judges. And it is not even evident in much of the period of the kings of Israel and Judah. Depending on which modern scholar one follows, monotheism in the strict sense, according to this view, could be as late as the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC, in the writing of the prophet that modern scholarship has labeled as the second or Deutero-Isaiah, that is in the book of Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, and perhaps other chapters. Indeed, for proponents of biblical monotheism as late, the second Isaiah has been the favored option. This developmental analytical view, it should be added, became prominent in the 19th century as part of the larger movement in academic European biblical scholarship of the period to look at all biblical literature, religion, and history in a developmental or evolutionary way. A second trend with these different terms in the scholarly discussion of biblical monotheism espouses the opposite thesis to the one just described, namely that monotheism was not late in the history of ancient Israel, but early, even at the beginning of Israel as a national community. This view is perhaps most prominently displayed by the Israeli scholar Yechezkel Kaufman, and you see a marvelous English abridgment and translation of his 8-volume work in Hebrew by the late colleague Moshe Greenberg of the University of Pennsylvania, and then he emigrated to Israel at the Hebrew University. Kaufman, who died in 1960, mounted a direct attack on the late developmental approach, arguing that monotheism in Israel was not the outcome of a gradual reduction in the number of entities that could be considered gods. Rather, monotheism was the product of a human insight and intellectual revolution at a particular moment or moments in time. Theologically, one might call this a revelation, but Kaufman, being a secular Jewish nationalist philosopher, appeared to want to avoid such terminology. There's some hint of it in the original Hebrew, but it's rather vague. So he basically is talking about this appreciation of a single God as an intellectual insight. What was involved here, Kaufman explained, was the perception by some spiritually enlightened person, the Bible credits this to Moses especially, that at the center of the universe is a single coherent force, a force that stands outside of and above all other phenomena which it creates and controls, and through which it may express itself. This perception of deity should be called monotheistic, argued Kaufman, and the best proof of it, and this is quite interesting, the best proof of its early and fundamental importance in biblical religion is that the biblical authors, he proposed, did not essentially understand the polytheism of their neighboring cultures, Canaanite, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, etc. Polytheism is actually, Kaufman went on, quite sophisticated, as I've already intimated. The gods can be powerful and exalted, controlling major portions of nature, appearing in different forms, anthropomorphic and non-anthropomorphic, and manifest in different images like sculptures, which thus represent a portion of the god's divinity, but without encapsulating all of it. These deities can be, moreover, responsive to human prayer or not, as the gods wish. And as we've already seen, they are regularly arranged in a complex social order or pantheon. But none of this sophisticated polytheism and its complexity, said Kaufman, or almost none of it, can be found in the biblical way of looking at other religions. For the biblical authors, Kaufman asserted, the gods of these polytheistic religions are not presented as high, powerful beings. They are at the most little spirits, and the tales about these high gods that we know as myths are barely in evidence in the Bible. And where you can perhaps spot a myth in the Bible, the stories are mere snippets whose fragmentary, incoherent character suggests that they were really not understood or believed in by the biblical authors. As for the images of these gods, they are not, for the biblical authors, living manifestations of divinities. They are lifeless, no gods at all, nothing more than the wood, stone, or metal out of which they were constructed by their human makers. This biblical understanding of polytheism could not have been more glaring. But how could this have come about, asked Kaufman, given that such polytheism was all over the place in the biblical world of ancient Israel? The answer Kaufman proposed is that the initial perception of God as the central primary force in the universe, above and outside all other phenomena, must have been so basic, so pervasive, and so powerful in the biblical worldview, and so different from the essential worldview of polytheism, that it warped the ability of the biblical authors to appreciate another, here polytheistic, view of reality. Because this monotheistic view was so all-encompassing in the Bible and for its authors and audiences, Kaufman concluded, it must have been something that had come to biblical Israel at the beginning of its history, not at the end, for then we would have found in the Bible a greater representation of other points of view. It's a very powerful scene, but it makes one fundamental assumption which can be and has been contested, namely that where you do find slivers of ancient myths, as Kaufman recognized, these represent the warped view of the biblical authors. He does not allow for the fact that the slivers represent deliberate satirical images on the part of the biblical authors of these polytheistic religions. And for satirical images to be activated, one has to assume the biblical authors knew that polytheism was something else. Otherwise, why satirize it? So this has been one debate, and yet because Kaufman was such a powerful writer and thinker, he is still around even if he's no longer maintained as strongly as he was in earlier decades, even in Israel, where he was dominant for a long time, but now not at all. There's one other dominant trend in the study of biblical monotheism that is worth mentioning and common to what I have been discussing. Given the existence of other cultures that surrounded Israel in the ancient Near East, we have obviously to ask questions about what kinds of religious beliefs and worship were prevalent in these cultures, namely those of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Canaanite peoples in what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt, and Jordan. All of these peoples who the Bible admits were direct neighbors of Israel. Archaeology has provided us in the form of textual and non-textual artifacts with a wealth of information about them. Here I'm going to focus on Mesopotamia as the counterpart, if you will, of Israel, with which Israel, according to the Bible itself, had many contacts. And Mesopotamia, we have knowledge now in several 100,000 cuneiform documents, as well as excavations all over ancient Iraq and eastern Syria, as well as into the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. and a satellite culture that uses Mesopotamian culture, namely the Hittites and what is now modern Turkey. How does one compare with these the PowerPoint, the title page of his book, Moses and Monotheism? The German is Der Mann Mose, the man Moses. It was changed when it was translated almost as soon as he composed it in the year that he died, 1939, having been carried away from Vienna, fortunately, to London. Freud, in his book Moses and Monotheism, or Der Mann Mose, the idea he admits in this book was not original to him, but he adapted it in his own way. And the idea simply was that Moses borrowed the whole idea of monotheism from the Egyptian world, and more specifically from the Egyptian pharaoh of the 1300s BC named Akhenaten. We all know about him. The famous king who had a particular vision of the Aton, A-T-O-N, which was the divine sun disk, and that this left a residue, if you will, not only in the way the biblical writers considered the God of Israel, whose name we will pronounce here, Yahweh, but also it appears, according to this analysis, in several particular places. Psalm 104, for example, talks about God in terms of a solar radiance, which is exactly Aton. Akhenaten dies about 100 years or so before the presumed date, if there was a Moses, in the 1200s BC. Well, the question is, if Moses knew something directly or indirectly about the Akhenaten revolution, which was canceled after his death by rival Egyptian authorities, if Moses knew enough about this, how did he know it? So this point has been raised, discussed even before Freud. He took his main idea here from a German scholar named Sellin, S-E-L-L-I-N, who argued about it in the early part of the 20th century, end of the 19th perhaps, but it's now no longer as much in fashion as it was. So what we have, if we look at Mesopotamia, and here we go back now to the last page of the PowerPoint, page number 5. That's it.
That's fine. Yep.
And we look at number 18. We have a series of divine hymns, hymns of praise to particular gods. And I give you one, which is in English and also Akkadian and Sumerian. It's a bilingual. And it reads in English as follows: in heaven, who is exalted? You, meaning in this case the moon god Sin, you alone are exalted. On earth, who is exalted? You alone are exalted. An alternative hymn is addressed to the goddess Ishtar. Apart from you, I have no God who guides rightly. Now, proponents of pure monotheism as the distinctive and unique contribution of the Hebrew Bible to the world of the ancient Near East will be troubled by statements like this. And so one response has been, this is not really monotheistic. Certainly the last line addressed to Ishtar, apart from you, I have no God who guides rightly, could be understood to be a monolatric, a species of monolatry. The speaker here has only Ishtar as his god or goddess, but he reserves apparently the right for others to have their gods. However, the preceding statement seems much more absolutist. Who is exalted in heaven? You. You alone are exalted. Who is on earth exalted? You alone are exalted. Now, you could argue even here that there may be other gods who have a status lower on the totem pole, as it were, but they're not exalted. So this is not a kind of pure monotheism. But then you have just the notion that some modern biblical scholars who want to maintain monotheism as unique to Israel would say to statements like this, they are only statements of the moment, because you can see the speaker in one form is addressing the moon god Sin because he's bringing an offering to the altar of Sin, and in the next he may be addressing Ishtar because he's bringing a sacrifice or a gift to the goddess Ishtar. So this isn't really monotheism. It's sort of lazy kind of monotheism. I would say in answer to this kind of apologetics, that at the moment when the speaker says, in heaven, who is exalted, all of his or her focus is on Sin. As it were, for that moment, there is only one God, Sin. For that moment, there is only one goddess, Ishtar. How does this differ, perhaps, from the biblical monotheistic trend? Stay with me a little longer and we'll see what happens. Okay, I've given you a broad introduction, really, to the issues of dealing with monotheism in the Hebrew Bible and of the alternative views that have been put forward about this phenomenon, both within the possibility of the Bible and outside. Indeed, modern anthropologists, people like Edward Sapir and Paul Radin, R-A-D-I-N, have argued that from their ethnological work, the notion of a high God beside whom there is no other is not exclusive to the ancient Near East altogether. Radin has spoken of the great mother goddess in the Kagaba Indians, natives of South American Colombia. And he's also, and Sapir has mentioned this, from the Dakota American natives in the Middle West, the tradition of a supernal god who is, excuse me, let me just get my piece of paper here. The Wakantanka, the great mystery or the great spirit, who enfolds within himself all the other gods. So it's a kind of henotheism, monotheism. So where does the biblical portrait of the God of Israel, whose name apparently was pronounced Yahweh, Y-A-H-W-E-H, how does the biblical source come to deal with him? Here we go back now to the second page of my
Let's see if I can do that.
huh?
Okay, I'm gonna have to,
You have to go back up.
yep.
That's it. And here I've tried to arrange passages from the Bible that represent a variety of views about the God of Israel and other gods. The first is this passage under number 1 from Genesis 6. In the middle of the story about the biblical flood is a gem of an episode, which I'll read very quickly. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, or the sons of gods, saw that these women were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord, where you see Lord, it translates the name Yahweh. Then Yahweh said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These Nephilim were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Now, to all you classicists, this sounds like something taken out of Hesiod or of Ovid or any number of other classical sources. Here is an attempt to talk about the marriage of humans and divinities, and their product apparently are heroes like a Hercules, here called the Nephilim, and yet it's stuck in here. In number 2, Genesis 31, we have an attempt to deal with this in a slightly different way. This is a story of the patriarch Jacob, who had dealings with his father-in-law, Laban, whose daughters he married. And one of the daughters, Rebecca, took from the father Laban certain private deities that were evidently available in some kind of visual form. And so Jacob and these 2 daughters and their entourage escaped from Laban, in whose custody, as it were, they had been living. They escaped in the middle of the night with these pillar figurines. Laban was furious, and he gets on his high horse, as it were, or his donkeys, and goes after Jacob. But fortunately, instead of actual warfare, excuse me, in this particular passage of Genesis 31, the 2 figures, Jacob and his father-in-law Laban, decide to call it a truce, and a truce with a physical boundary between them. And the boundary is marked by a pillar in line 51. Laban says to Jacob, I see this heap. So it's a heap of stones and a pillar, which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me. Otherwise, harm will come. And then comes the really principal sentence here in line 53. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice on the height and called his kinsfolk to eat bread, and they ate bread, and they tarried all night in the hill country. What's going on here? You have 2 human beings who are ultimately related through Abraham, and beyond Abraham, actually, through Abraham's father, Nahor. And this God is called the God of their father. But in line 53, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor are recognized as separate deities. And that is confirmed by the fact that the verb judge is in the plural in Hebrew, not in the singular, even though the phrase the God of their father is an effort to say that the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor are the same deity. So Jacob then swears by his God, who is called the fear of his father Isaac. All these deities, therefore, are deities of the clans to which they belong. But there is clearly here a recognition of 2 sets of deities swearing an oath of a border, and nobody is the worse for it. Laban is not criticized as being an idol maker. nor is Abraham, as Jacob, exalted as a worshiper of the only God. So can we go back up to the full page now, please? So at the beginning, we have statements like this, which suggest that the biblical authors are aware that back in the times well before them, the times of the patriarchs, there were other gods, and the God of their clan, ultimately to be called Yahweh, but here the God of Abraham, or the God of the fear of Isaac, that's our God, but he can enter into an agreement with gods of other groups. If we move a little beyond this to the efforts in number 3 and number 4, we have a recognition of these other gods. In number 3, we have a psalm which is still recited in Jewish liturgical practice to open the Sabbath. It's apparently a hymn of praise to the Lord, namely to Yahweh, and who is asked to praise him? What's translated here, O heavenly beings. The Hebrew for this is the sons of gods. Ascribe to Yahweh, O sons of gods. Ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength. Ascribe to Yahweh the glory of his name. Worship Yahweh in holy splendor. So once more, if there is a God, and here the God Yahweh is appealed to, and apparently a God who stands over and above the heavenly beings, the sons of gods, nonetheless, there is a relationship between this Yahweh and these heavenly beings. It's not a pure monotheism. Number 4 expands on this from the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 4, verses 19 to 20. And when you look up, Moses is here haranguing the Israelites who are on the eastern side of the Jordan River, ready to cross over into the western side, which becomes their primary home. When you look up, Moses says, when you look up to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host, a general term, tzava in Hebrew, all the host of heaven, do not be led astray and bow down to them and serve them. They are things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under heaven. But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron smelter, namely out of Egypt in the Exodus, to become a people of his very own possession, as you are now. So here is Yahweh and the other gods who are allowed to exist, but Yahweh is understood as a kind of imperial God, an emperor under whom all the others bow in submission. And this is extended in number 5. Again from Deuteronomy in verses 8 and 9. When the Most High, which is here a epithet for Yahweh, when he gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of men, he fixed the bounds of the peoples, but actually from the ancient Greek translation, the so-called Septuagint, as well as a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls of this passage, it should be, he fixed the bounds of the sons of God. He fixed the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. In the traditional text of the Hebrew Bible, it's according to the number of the sons of Israel, which can be shown to be a later apologetic to get rid of the fact that what is being asserted here is that God, the Most High, operates as control over all the nations and he separates them out, giving to each of these 70 nations. This is the image in hand. He gives to each of the 70 nations another God, but he takes for his own portion Israel. For Yahweh's portion is his people. Yahweh alone guided him. No foreign God was with him. Here again we have an imperial presence, an imperial divinity. As both Deuteronomy 4 and number 4, and here in number 5 indicates. Number 6, the prophet Micah has it reflected in a somewhat different way. For all the peoples walk, each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of Yahweh our God forever and ever. Again, if this is a situation, it's a situation of monolatry we've been talking about. We have our God, they have their gods. Sometimes the view is we have our God and he controls all that they have and their gods. So let's move on to number 7. This is from the beginning of the Ten Commandments. The first of which in verse 2 is, I am Yahweh, again, Lord meaning Yahweh. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me, in front of me. Is that a statement of pure monotheism, that there is no other God? Or rather, is it a statement that there is no other God for you, Israel, because I'm the one who saved you? And then the text goes on in verses 4 and 5. The result is, you shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above or on the earth below or in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God. They can worship what they want, but if you start messing with their gods, God help you. Let's go to the second page of the handout.
Page 3.
Page 3, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, let's just have the whole page, please.
Okay.
And here, under number 10, we have a typical phrase of this same imperial presence, although it doesn't look like that. From the book of Exodus, chapter 15, one of the oldest poems, if not the oldest poem, preserved in the Bible. Here, in the wake of the victory over the Egyptians at what we would now call it, the Red Sea, the poet, who is apparently Moses, says, who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? Is this pure monotheism? No. There are the gods, they just don't measure up. And finally, in number 11, again, we go back to Deuteronomy, again from a very famous statement which continues in Jewish history, the so-called Shema. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Well, here again, Lord is Yahweh. There have been a lot of different attempts to translate this phrase, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. But in the Hebrew, and this is more or less reflected in this English translation, we have two parallel phrases. Yahweh is our God and Yahweh alone. In Hebrew, it would be Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. What does alone mean here? This has been the problem, and it's been a subject of interpretation right from antiquity to the present. If alone is parallel to our God, in the first instance, alone should say it means that God, Yahweh, is our God alone. No other God fills that slot. It may also mean, as philosophical interpretations begin to crowd out the interpretive history of the Bible, that God himself is a single, organized, integrated unit. It's not simply God with a lot of little gods hanging around, but he's God alone. But I think in the first instance, alone probably indicates that this is the God that Israel shall worship and no other. And you have further statements in lines 12 and 13. Let's go to page 4. No, I'm sorry, we're going to go back to 3. Despite this effort among the biblical authors to say, first, there are other gods, 2, these other gods don't disappear, but they're in relationship to the God of Israel, and that Israel has this God only for itself and no other deity. And in some versions, this God, Yahweh, is the imperial God ruling over the other gods, whose assignment as gods of the other nations, Yahweh is the one responsible for. Yahweh is the one who assigns these other gods to other nations. Did everybody believe this in ancient Israel? You can imagine not. First, because of the intensity of the statements that we have been reading about the power of Yahweh. But we have a couple of instances in Numbers 8 and 9 of actual resistance among the population. In 1 Kings 18, we have a celebrated encounter between the prophet Elijah. You don't want to meet this guy on the street at night. He's a terror. And he's here in the contest with the followers or the prophets of the principal Canaanite god who is called Baal. And they have a contest, according to this episode, at Mount Carmel, roughly where the modern city of Haifa is in modern Israel. And in this contest, the aim is to show which is the real God and which is the false God, which is the God that can do things, particularly for Israel, and which is the God that's a faker. And so each of the groups, the 400 prophets of the Canaanite god Baal and the single prophet Elijah of the god Yahweh, try to deal with an issue of water coming down. And the first of the group, namely the prophets of Baal, try to get their deity to consume a burnt offering. The wood, the stones, and the dust, and linked up to the water that was in the trough. But despite all of the furious, ecstatic dancing, this God doesn't respond. Then we come to Elijah and Yahweh, and what happens? Yahweh sends down a fire, burns up all of the offerings of the god, of the so-called god Baal, and kills all the prophets of Baal. And the result is the statement which Elijah yells after this has happened. This is pretty bloody. The women said, everybody having seen this fire consume the prophet Baal and his offerings and his adherents, they say, Yahweh indeed is God. Yahweh indeed is God. Now, what does this mean? It may mean certainly that Yahweh is our God, but it may be a more strenuous, a more extreme statement that there is only one God and it is Yahweh, not Baal. in number 9, from the prophet Jeremiah during the Babylonian exile period of the 6th century BC, we find that a group of Israelites from the country of Judah have left Judah to escape to Egypt with their prophet Jeremiah. But Jeremiah sees that all these people who are supposed to be law-abiding Israelites, in fact, worship another deity called the Queen of Heaven. And he remonstrates with them. He calls them out. You're not worshiping a deity, it's just an idol. What are you doing? And they say, the women say in particular, we have been forced to leave our home in Israel, in Judah, because we didn't worship this Queen of Heaven. And now we're going to worship her, and perhaps we'll have good fortune smile on us. So here Jeremiah is trying to get them to worship Yahweh, but apparently he is not succeeding. Let's move on now to page 4. We come to the final area of concern, which will be on the pages 4 and 5. And this is the prophet in the book of Isaiah called the second, or Deutero-Isaiah, whom I mentioned earlier, the prophet whose chapters involve particularly chapter 40 through 55 and maybe 34 to 35. But I'll concentrate here on passages from Isaiah 40 and following. And the argument, the old argument, as you recall, is that only by the time of this Isaiah, who lives in the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC, this is when the bulk of the remnant of Israel, which was in Judah, was captured by the Babylonian armies and taken, at least the leading portion of this population was taken as exiles to Babylon. And that's where they were. And they remain there until the Babylonian Empire is itself destroyed by the Achaemenid Persian Empire in the year 538 by the Persian king Cyrus. But while they're in Babylonian exile, they feel pretty bad because it looks as if to them their God, Yahweh, has deserted them. Otherwise, he would not have allowed this exile. And along comes this second Isaiah to say there is still hope because we have to understand what kind of God we're dealing with and what kinds of gods the Babylonians and others have. And so you have here several different passages, particularly 14 and 15, which in second Isaiah's terminology are arranged as court cases where Yahweh speaks through the prophet saying, for example, in number 14, set forth your case and bring your proofs, says the king of Jacob being another term for Yahweh. Let them bring them and tell us what is to happen. Let them tell us what happened in the past, the former things, what they are, that we may consider them and that we may know their outcome. Or let them tell us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good to do harm, that we may be afraid and terrified of you. So what the Isaiah prophet is saying here, acting as a spokesperson for Yahweh, is he's addressing supposedly these other gods who may be present in statues or other kinds of images. And he's asking them, okay, you gods, show me your stuff. If you are real gods, you can explain what happened in the past and you can predict the future. You can tell me what is for good and what is for harm. And so we have to pause before the last verse 24, where there's no response. And so Yahweh through Isaiah says, you indeed are nothing. Your work is nothing at all. Whoever chooses you is an abomination. And 15 is similar to this, where again, God, Yahweh, through Isaiah, speaks to presumably these other gods, but this time he identifies himself in verse 4. I am the first, and I am the last, and besides me there is no God. Who is like me? Let them proclaim it. Let them declare and set it forth before me. Who has announced from old the things to come? Let them tell me or tell us what it is to be. Don't be afraid. Don't be to fear. Have I not told you from of old and declared it? You are my witness. Is there any God besides me? There is no other rock. I know not one. You can see that some of this language is like the language we have examined earlier, but much more intensive and much more explicit about the fact that there are no other gods. If there were, they could predict the future, explain the past, offer good and evil, and in other words, be true deities. And the rest of 15 in lines 9 and following goes on to talk about what these other gods are. They're simply idols made of wood and stone, and they're made by human beings. And they can't react to anything, whereas our God reacts to everything. Now, is this pure monotheism? My colleague at Brown University, Saul Olian, says that while this seems to be a major focus of the second Isaiah, he detects a few places where other beings, other divine beings are allowed. So number 16 is one of them. To whom then will you compare me? But I should be like him? Says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these, who brings out their host by number, calling them by name. So here, the God of Israel is certainly asserted to be the strongest God, but he's one who calls into being and creates the host. And the host here means the divine group of deities who operate under him. And in fact, in number 17, we have in the same second Isaiah a statement about a battle that this God Yahweh had with a god of old who was a god of the sea, namely Rahab, whom this God defeated. This God Yahweh defeated Rahab and claimed sovereignty. At least that suggests that there was a deity around. So let's go to our final page and our conclusion. We have been talking about deities of different types, and it looks to me as if the passages we just read from the second Isaiah are almost there in terms of a pure monotheism in the set of deity with Yahweh, the only member. There is a little bit of evidence, as we've just seen, that Olian has pointed to, that suggests that there may be slivers of other deities around, but they are not to be trusted anymore. They are not deities worth anything except as the principal deity, Yahweh, allows them to function at all. And this is taken up in number 21 with another text, Psalm 82, which is a remarkable, if not one of the most remarkable pieces of theology in the Hebrew Bible. Let's look at it in particular. Can we get a slightly, that's it. Thank you so much. It starts the label a psalm or song of Asaph. That's the rubric. It's not part of the psalm itself. And it starts by recognizing the God of Israel, whom it calls Elohim. which is actually a grammatical plural in Hebrew, meaning gods. But here we have a distinction between what I would call big Elohim, which is the plural applied to Yahweh, and little Elohim, which are the gods around him. This is very much like what Olean suggested worked for the passages in 2nd Isaiah, where the word Elohim is only used for Yahweh. It's not used for the other gods. So here in Psalm 82, big Elohim takes up his position in the divine council, where the word for divine is El. In the midst of the little Elohim, this is my interpretation, he initiates a judicial proceeding or accusation, which goes as follows. He's now addressing the little Elohim. How long will you carry out acts of injustice and show bias toward the wicked? Selah, that's apparently a mark of the director when nobody still quite knows about it. What about acting justly, you little Elohim, toward the powerless and the orphan? What about maintaining the rights of the wretched and the poor? What about rescuing the powerless and the needy from the grip of the wicked and saving them? And here you must pause, which is what I tried to indicate in the translation. In other words, the big God, the big Elohim, has made this accusation against the little Elohim, and he gets no response, because he goes on in line 5 to say about the little Elohim, they do not know, nor have they any understanding. They walk around in darkness, with the result that all the foundations of the earth are tottering. Now here we must understand something. When he says these little gods do not know, nor have they any understanding, he's here basing himself on a definition of what is a deity. For this psalmist, like the story of the Garden of Eden, a god is a being that has two characteristics. One is immortality, and the other is a special knowledge. And here, this big Elohim is saying, these little Elohim have not exercised knowledge or understanding. In other words, knowledge is not simply an abstract static phenomenon. Knowledge is something active. If you know something, you act on it. And these gods have not acted on helping people who otherwise would not be helped, who are powerless, orphan, wretched, and poor. The result is the whole universe is shaking, because the structure of the universe, with me as big God Elohim and you as little gods doing my bidding, you have not proved to be part of the system. What system is he talking about? The system that we read in earlier passages, particularly from the book of Deuteronomy, where the imperial God gives to other nations little gods and takes for himself Israel. So he's then accused these little gods in line 15 of absolutely without knowledge. So the result is line 6. I had indeed thought, Elohim you are, even sons of the Most High, all of you. In other words, at one point I thought you were gods, little gods to be sure, but gods. But now I see you're just blowhards. You have no deity in you. So now, like human beings, or like Adam, the Hebrew word is Adam and it can function in both ways, like humans, you shall die. Like one of the officials, you shall fall. In other words, because you have given up knowledge, I'm taking away from you the other feature of deity, immortality. You shall die like any human being, any human official. Which leads to the final statement, where the psalmist turns to God, big Elohim, and he says, rise up, O Elohim, rule with justice the earth. Surely it is you who shall, let me just Surely it is you who shall take or extend possession over all the nations. What's happened here? The original system of an empire with Yahweh as the emperor and the little gods as his subjects has now failed. A new system has come into place where only Big Elohim is in play, and he will rule over all the nations. But why is he called Elohim, which grammatically is a plural? Because he embodies within himself all of the little Elohim who had failed. He takes over their responsibility and absorbs them into himself. In other words, this is the Psalms, the biblical Hebrew answer to henotheism. Here we have a statement. Let me conclude. We've seen that the whole picture of deity in biblical Israel is a highly complex one. It may be that there is a movement toward a full or nearly full pure monotheism in the second Isaiah and here in Psalm 82. But you can see that there are slivers that remain of other deities, whether under the aegis of Yahweh or not. And in fact, we have to go later on to late antiquity and to the Middle Ages to find more powerful statements of monotheism as being a single deity who is the only member of the set called deity. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides is one such example. And yet, in both Christianity and in Judaism, as also in Islam, the three major monotheistic religions, but not by any means the only ones, there is always somebody else lurking around, whether they're called angels, whether they're called spirits, whether they're called any number of other terms. You can't have a monotheism without some little deities. So where do I end up on the picture? If there is a gradual evolution toward a more powerful and unique statement about deity, it's one that is always in the process of becoming. Thank you so much. If you have time, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, we can take some questions. Thank you very much, Peter, for an amazing talk. I've been trying to get myself to read more adult books than just children's books lately, and this topic is something I've been reading about lately. So I was very excited to hear this today. Robert, then Amanda.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. One of the things that really jumped out at me was this idea of boundaries and and God, where Laban, if you respect our boundaries, we respect our separate divinities.
Right.
And by Psalm 82, you're seeing that called into play. And then with the Babylonian exile is the ultimate destruction of boundaries, and not and so the captives in Babylon who come back with a monotheist, the most monotheistic version yet, is really a result of the breaking of boundaries.
Yes, I think you can very much bring the boundary issue into it, which of course then relates to the general theme of this workshop about xenos. I would say that boundary is at first a limiting factor, even though in Mesopotamia, as I mentioned, there are deities that seem to go beyond their initial boundary. A deity like Marduk, for example, in the so-called Babylonian creation story, Enuma Elish in Akkadian, is somebody who is called by the council of gods to break boundaries by eliminating a group of older gods. He does so, and he's descended from these older gods, as the text makes clear. But once he becomes the conqueror of these older deities, he recreates the universe out of the body of the principal older deity, a woman named Tiamat, which means sea, salt sea. And he, then the middle part of that myth, it's a myth or an epic of the creation story in Babylonia, is a description of how Marduk creates the universe. It involves a tradition of astronomy that the author of Enuma Elish brings in what was known astronomically. He makes the headquarters, the anchor position of this universe, his own particular city of Babylon. Again, this is perfectly normal, but it's Babylon now, not some little city on the Euphrates River, but Babylon as the city universally. So boundaries in and out are, I think you're absolutely correct, are an important part of the definition at work here. And we find, therefore, in the Bible, a preoccupation with boundaries on the divine level as the biblical authors are preoccupied with it on the human level, recognizing as they do that Israel as a state is really a pipsqueak among the great empires. Thank you.
Amanda.
Yeah, hi. Really enjoyed this. My question is, you showed the various passages of the Old Testament writings, and we're considering it kind of as from my impression, as a Old Testament corpus versus the various authors. So I know you were saying about Second Isaiah, but I'm talking about like the Elohim, the Adonai, those that within. Yeah, okay. So do you find this I'm not saying process theology, but I'm saying this process of monotheism, turning up in certain authors more than other authors within Second Isaiah, within, Deuteronomy and whatnot. Do you understand my question?
Yes, it's actually a very complex and important question. Let me start by making a general statement about the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. On the one hand, it is a group of books, which is, of course, what the Bible means in Greek, ta biblia, the books. And there is recognition already in antiquity that these books do not tell the same story always. On the other hand, we see gradually emerging toward the end of the first millennium BC or BCE, gradually emerging a canon of books that make up the first part of scripture for Christians or scripture for Jews. And for Muslims, it's part of the scriptures of the past to which Muhammad and the Quran represent the next stage. In other words, you have a tension in the history of the composition of the books of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. You have a tension between the many and the one. The many books that make up the text, reflecting different times, different authors, different social strata, et cetera, and the search for coherence among these many strata. And canon is an effort to organize all of these books around certain central themes. And what these are has kept people in business for 2,500 years. What are the central themes that allow the books of the Old Testament to be appreciated as an Old Testament, or as in Hebrew, a Tanakh, which itself is an interesting Hebrew phrase because it refers to what in classical Judaism recognizes as three separate categories of books in the Hebrew Bible. So we have on the one hand pluribus, on the other hand unum. one out of many, many out of one. And that tension continues to the present. That's one thing. The other point that you wanted to make, I think, let me just apprise it again. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Could you, Amanda, just give it to
Yeah,
me?
I was just interested in do you find this a more monotheistic stance as opposed to a monolatry, or theism? Do you find a more, exclusive, for lack of a better word, monotheistic stance in certain, like in the Elohim and the Adonai author, the Yahweh author? Do you find that's a more representative on that author within Deuteronomy, within Second Isaiah, etc., as opposed to others? I guess is what I'm saying, because I am seeing it as a pluribus that is an unum. But yes, I personally don't believe that Isaiah wrote all of Isaiah. I believe that there was definitely authors that contributed into this. And can you follow the author, as you follow a more monotheistic stance?
Yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's just a qualification I would admit. There are different authors who have different views of who the God Yahweh is. The question is whether these are differences that can be charted chronologically. In other words, is the second Isaiah the end of a story? Is Kaufman, to go back to the beginning of what I was talking about, wrong or right by saying that no, at the beginning there was already the notion that it was only Yahweh? Some people try to keep a hold on a bit of Kaufman, saying that at the beginning there was a kind of incipient or inchoate monotheism, which over centuries gradually became more articulate. And the second Isaiah is one of its most articulate expressions. But then we have also Psalm 82, which tells us how we got there. Namely, that the original imperial system broke down because the little guys didn't behave properly. And so the big guy takes over for everybody, but he keeps a memory of the little guys because he's called Elohim. In other words, I'm talking about texts that are really theological in the same way that when we talk about Aquinas in the Middle Ages or his equivalent in Judaism, Maimonides or Al-Farabi in Islam, only a different form of discussion is offered. Stories, poetry of praise and narrative, godless. Nonetheless, we dismiss them as trivial at our peril. These are highly sophisticated pieces of work. Did the hoi polloi, did the population as a whole understand what was going on here? Probably not completely, but maybe in some ways, the notion that at the least for ancient Israel, Yahweh is our God. And for those who say, I want the Queen of Heaven, fife on them. So my plea is that while it may be difficult to construct a perfectly good chronological, developmental, evolutionary scheme, and anthropologists and historians of religion have moved away from evolutionary schemes because they often reflect more on the modern exponent of the scheme than on the data the exponent is working on. While they've moved away, there is something about the second Isaiah and Psalm 82 whose date we cannot clearly determine, except that it seems to be based off of the imperial system, which it now declares bankrupt. And so therefore it probably is late as well, maybe Babylonian exile or later, I don't know. So in that sense, I still would hold on to a bit of a developmental scheme. But even when you get to that scheme, there are still all these little guys, these little Elohim who have not died yet, despite what the Psalm says. And that's where we are today. When we go into a church or into a mosque or into a synagogue or their equivalent, you see not only visual and you read and hear testimonies to the principal God, but you hear other deities involved. The Trinity is an effort to deal with this problem in Christian circles. And the debates over how to deal with the Trinity almost destroyed Christianity in its first centuries, until finally the Nicene Creed was promulgated and accepted. But it was accepted because behind it lay the power of the Roman Empire, starting with Constantine. So if I have confused you a little bit, I'm very happy. Have I suggested that life is neither black nor white, but somewhere in the middle, using both black and white? That's what I hope for. And that's the way I try to teach when I was teaching, and I suspect most of you have done the same.
Thank you.
We've gone a bit over our time, but if there's
Oh,
any,
no, this has been great. Do we have any other questions here? Looking at,
Peter, can I ask you a quick question about
sure.
Isaiah 43? It's verses 9 through 12 I'm looking at,
Yep.
and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It's an intriguing passage about the Lord inviting the people to bring together all the nations and invite them to give witness, bear witness to their gods. And as evidence, it's almost like a courtroom. I think you mentioned this witnessing. It's almost like a courtroom scene where the other, and then the contrast to that will be the people of Israel who will bear witness to the love, fidelity, devotion of their God, in contrast to what would happen when the other nations come to give witness to their gods. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And there's
Yes.
some very, very clear language embedded in there in between mentioning of witnesses of, the language is, there was no God before me, there won't be any after me, I'm the Lord, besides me, there's no Savior. It's very strong language about one as a contrast to the other nations um, bringing their gods. But I love this. I love the image of all the nations coming together and like a debate, like a big sort of courtroom. Let people bring in their witnesses, and all you people have to witness to me. Anyway,
No, I'm glad you, I originally was going to add this to the PowerPoint, but there was already too much there. But this is another statement of the sort that is on the PowerPoint, numbers 14 and 15. But let me deal specifically. Sometimes there's a whole series of these courtroom statements in the second Isaiah. I wrote a long article about it at some point. I can send that to you if you're interested. And there is a genre of courtroom argument about deity in the Hebrew Bible, and particularly in this second Isaiah. Sometimes the audience is other nations, as it is here in 43, 8, and 9 and following. Sometimes it's just an unnamed audience, which could be the gods themselves. In other words, the prophet is saying, hey, you gods, show me that you're gods. And then there's no answer, of course. So then he starts to vilify them in terms that we might not accept as polite discourse. So here he has the nations all together. Is this something that actually happened? One doesn't know. The rhetoric is here pretty high. But if it's a text like the others of the second Isaiah set in Babylon to a group of exiles, of Israelite or Judean exiles who were in Babylon, and Isaiah is speaking to them, they're surrounded by other nations. not only the Babylonians, but we know from Babylonian cuneiform sources that the Babylonians dragged other nations to Babylon as exiles, not simply the Judeans. So this may not be just simply a wholly concocted, imaginative audience, but maybe some of these others are listening in. Who was this crazy guy screaming? Then he says to them, I'm proposing a test as to what God is going on. Who among them can declare this and show us the former things? Former things is his code word for the past. Who can explain what happened in the past? Which means that the past has an organization to it, a pattern to it, a movement in time. Let them bring their witnesses to justify them and hear and say, it is true. Let these nations bring their own gods and let them try to make sense of the past. Whereupon Yahweh, who was speaking through the prophet, so this is some kind of ventriloquist going on here. Yahweh then says, I have witnesses. It's you, Israelites or Judeans, who are standing here before me as I speak. You are my servant whom I have chosen. In other words, this gets into another problem of the second Isaiah, who is the servant, but here it's clearly Israel as a whole, who is God's servant. And what does servant mean? Somebody who testifies to the existence of this deity as the one who can explain and can act on history. And then he identifies himself. No God was formed before me, no there shall be any after me. I am the Lord. This seems to pick up a little bit of the language of imperial deity, but it goes beyond it. We don't have statements, there's no God before me, and no God before me, no God after me. Besides me, there's no Savior. That can be found earlier. But in company with the statements, no God before me, no God after me, that's, I think, unique to this second Isaiah prophet. So then he concludes, if you will, in line 13, I am God, meaning Elohim, and also henceforth I am He. In other words, I am the only one allowed to use the term Elohim, God. I'm the only one who says He, who in Hebrew. There's none who can deliver from my hand, I work, and who can hinder it. So some might say the last line, none who can deliver, I work, and who can hinder it. That could be a statement allowing other gods, but none can work like me. But when you put this verse, none who can deliver, none who work and hinder like me, together with the statements just before it, no God was formed before me or after me. I am Elohim, henceforth I am He. When you put these all together as a unit, this is a statement of pure monotheism that is not in other texts. And what I'm suggesting is that Psalm 82 is an explanation of how we get there. Mm-hmm. Second Isaiah doesn't explain how we get there. Psalm 82 explains how we get there. Developmentally. Together, they form a degree of sophistication theologically, which is unbelievable. You don't have to be a believer. I mean, I'm talking about this as an historian. And it's there in the text. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes, thank you so much for an amazing lecture and coming back to CSI. I know many people were very happy that you were speaking this year. If we have no other questions, I think I will call it right here. Thanking Professor Machinist again for joining us with an amazing, deeply learned lecture. And that's day 3 in the books. We'll see folks tomorrow morning in Matt's course. And remember, we have a slight time shift tomorrow. At 4 o'clock is when Professor Stewart from Dartmouth will start talking. And then after her initial talk, we do have a film presentation after In the Valley of Elah, which is a movie from the early mid-2000s starring Tommy Lee Jones. And that will go along with her talk.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All
What
right,
a pleasure
thank
to
you.
be with you all.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much, everybody.
As always.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.